This tutorial is a revision for the topic of absorption costing. First of all, I'm going to go through some important bits of theory which you need to know in relation to absorption costing. First of all, you could be asked in the exam a theory question on the purpose of absorption costing. The purpose of costing. So you need to know 3 or 4 of the main purposes of costing, and these are in your textbook. The first main purpose of costing is number 1, financial control. And you need to be able to explain this. All businesses are profit-led businesses, and enabled to maximize profits, businesses must know their costs and be able to keep their costs under control. Remember, every £1 saved in costs is £1 more profit for the business. The second purpose of costing is planning. All businesses are involved in planning for the future, for planning what type of products to make and how much to make of them. Businesses may have to make a choice between which products that they are going to produce, and to enable them to decide which product is the most profitable, they will need to work out the costs of making both types of products, so that they then can make a choice in which one to reduce or stop producing and which one to continue to produce or to produce more. The third purpose of costing is pricing. The selling price of all products and services must cover the costs of the business, and what is left will make the business a profit. Businesses must ensure that they set at an appropriate selling price, enable costs to be covered and the business to make a profit. So an awareness of costing is vitally important. The fourth purpose of costing is to aid decision making. Businesses and business leaders are constantly making decisions regarding what products to stop producing and what products to produce more of. They need to have a full understanding and appreciation of costing so that they can make decisions regarding the production of their products. The second piece of theory which you need to know is in relation to types of costs, and you have revised this in the topic of break-even also. First of all, you need to be aware that a cost unit is an actual product which a cost can be attributed to. For example, making a mobile phone, a new car or a new house. A cost centre is an area of business activity which costs can be attributed to. For example, a functional area, a department, which costs can be allocated to. For example, the wages of the sales team can be attributed and sent to the sales department. Maintenance of equipment can be attached to the production department. There are different types of costs in businesses, and you need to be aware of these different types of costs. The first type of costs is direct costs, or otherwise known as prime costs. These are costs which can be directly identified to the production of a particular product. For example, the raw materials that are used and the labour that is used to make the product. For example, the cases that are used to make mobile phones. These costs increase directly with production. So when the business produces more of these products, the direct costs go up. For example, materials. The second group of costs is your indirect costs, or also called overheads. These are all the other costs that exist in a business. For example, the rent, the rates, the insurance. These costs do not vary directly with production. So if the business is closed, these costs still have to be paid. They cannot be definitely traced to a particular product. Costs have particular behaviours. For example, so the behaviour of costs, for example, some costs are fixed costs. Fixed costs are those costs that don't vary with production. They remain the same. It doesn't matter how many products are produced, these costs are the same. For example, rent and rates. Variable costs are those costs which vary directly with production. So when the business produces more, these costs go up. For example, materials. And also some costs are semi-variable. For example, the telephone bill. The telephone expenses have a fixed element, for example, the line rental, and a variable element, for example, the usage of calls. We're now going to look at the different types of the two different questions, and before we do, we're going to look at two different costing approaches which you could be asked about. The first costing approach is marginal costing. Marginal costing is where when the cost of a product has been calculated, it only includes the direct costs, the costs that are used to make the product. For example, materials, direct labour. Marginal costing ignores all other costs. It ignores your indirect costs, your overheads. For example, the light, the heating, the insurance of the business is ignored. For that reason, we do not use marginal costing. Instead, we use absorption costing. Absorption costing takes into account your direct costs plus your indirect when it's costing stock. Absorption means to soak up. So the cost of the product, the making of the product, includes the direct costs that went into making that product, for example the materials and the direct labour, but also includes an element of the indirect. Not them all, but only an element of the rent, an element of the rates, an element of the insurance. We're now going to complete one question, and this first question that we're going to complete is Pullet, and that is taken from the past paper June 2012. So you need to download the Pullet paper and you need to read through it. Read through the information very carefully, taking everything into account. So on the first page, question 2, page 8, you've got all the information about the business, gives you information about what the business does, how much hours are used to make the product, gives you information about the energy costs, the water costs and the rates, and how they are to be divided up. Gives information about the machine hours within the business. Then it tells you that the storeroom is going to be closed down and it's going to be redistributed using store issue notes, and it tells you how much store issue notes are given to each department. It gives you the table which you must complete. Now, in your book, I give you a number of steps. You need to learn these steps because whenever you're given a question, it will be semi-completed. You need to know which steps have been completed and which steps have not, i.e. where you start. In your textbook or in your workbook, you have got each of the steps, step 1 to 6. Step 1 is where you allocate the direct costs. Step 2 is where you allocate the indirect costs using a method of apportionment. Step 3 is where you calculate the total costs. Step 4 is where you reallocate the service centre costs to the other departments, i.e. you close down a department and move its costs over to the other departments. After you do that, you calculate the new total, step 5, and step 6 it may ask you to calculate the overhead absorption rate. So you need to learn steps 1 to 6 for you to be able to complete a question. In this question here, let us see what has been done so far in this question. Well, step 1 has been completed because we can see the direct costs have been allocated. So this is step 1, which has been done. Then when we look at step 2 is where you allocate their indirect costs. We can see that canteen costs have been allocated, depreciation has been allocated, but we're starting here at the energy costs. So this is step 2. However, step 2 has only been partly completed. We have to put in the total for energy, and we have to calculate the water charges and the rates before we do step 3, which is the new total. So let us start. The total costs for the total energy costs simply just have to be added up. 7 plus 5 plus 1 plus 1. You simply add those up and you get 14, and you write 14 in, which is those added up. The energy costs for each department gives you a total energy cost of 14. Now we have to calculate our water, and it tells us that the water is 20,000. Where do we get that from? We get it from our question, and the question tells us that the water charge is 20,000. How do we divide it up? It's divided up between the departments using floor space. Gives you the floor space for each department, and then gives you the total floor space of 10,000. So we take our water charges, which is 20,000. We divide it by the total floor space, which is 10,000. So 1 now equals £2. Okay, so we go back to our question. The floor space in production is 4,000. 4,000 multiplied by 2 gives us 8,000, because each one is worth 2. Assembly is 3,000. Floor space multiplied by 2 is 6,000. So we put in 6,000. For painting, the floor space is 2,000. 2,000 multiplied by 2 is 4. And finally, the storeroom floor space is 1,000. 1,000 multiplied by 2 is 2,000. Double check that it all adds up. 8 plus 6 plus 4 plus 2 gives us 20. Now we have to do the rates. The rates is 10,000. They've got the total in 10,000, but we have to divide it up. So I'm going to do it here. So the total rates is 10,000. They're telling us that how we divide up the rates is using floor space. Again, the total floor space remains the same, 10,000. So 10,000 divided by 10,000, 1 equals £1. So we have to now put it in. Production, the floor space is 4,000. 4,000 now multiplied by 1 is 4,000. We're dropping the noughts. For assembly, it's 3,000 divided by 1, which is 3. For painting, it's 2,000 divided by 1, which is 2,000. And for the storeroom, it's 1,000 divided by 1, which is 1,000. That's step 2 done. Now we complete step 3, where we have to add up all our costs for each department and put them in our total line. And when we do that, the grand total is 104. For production, if it all adds up to 58. For assembly, it all adds up to 23. For painting, it all adds up to 13. And for storeroom, it all adds up to 10. All of those added up. Now we're coming into step 4, and step 4 is where we close down a service centre department and move them over. And they've told us that we're going to close down the storeroom. The total costs of the storeroom is 10, and we're going to bring a portion of that over to every other department. They tell us up here that we're going to use store issue notes, of which there are 6,000 in assembly and 2,000 each in painting and assembly. So that gives us a total of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10,000. Don't make the mistake and only counting 1, 2. It's 6,000 in assembly and 2,000 each in painting. Sorry, 6,000 in production and 2,000 each in assembly and painting gives a total of 10,000. So the storeroom, the total costs of the storeroom is 10,000. So we're going to take that away and we're going to move it over, but we're going to use the total store issue notes, which the total is 10,000, so 1 equals £1. So for production it was 6,000 notes multiplied by £1, which is 6. For assembly is 2,000 notes multiplied by £1, which is 2, and the same for painting. 2,000 notes multiplied by £1 is 2. So now we complete step 5, and step 5 is our total in step 3 plus what we brought over. 104 was the grand total, it's still 104. For production 58, but we brought 6 over from storeroom, so that adds up to 64. For assembly 23 plus 2 over from the storeroom, so that adds up to 25. And for painting 13, but brought 2 over, so it adds up to 15. And you get 23 marks for completing that question. Now we're on to step 5, and step 5 is where we have to calculate the overhead absorption rate. Now they're telling us that they are going to use machine hours for the overhead absorption rate. So what you have to do is you have to then go back to your original question and find out what the machine hours were. 16,000 in production, 5,000 in assembly and 5,000 in painting, and you have to write that in. So you're writing in 16,000, 5,000 and 5,000. On the next line it tells you to write in the overhead rate for each department. But what you have to do is go back to your costs of each department and divide them by the machine hours. So this is where you need your calculator. So if we go back to production, the grand costs in production were 64,000. 1, 2, 3. We're going to use machine hours, so divided by 16,000, and that gives us £4. Okay. For assembly, the costs in assembly were 25,000, and you divide that by 5,000 hours, and that gives you £5 per hour. And painting, the cost of the painting, grand total in painting is 15,000. You put into your calculator 15,000 divided by 5,000 hours, which gives you £3 per hour. And you get 6 marks for doing that. Now, 2 bits of theory I'm going to recap on now. The first bit of theory is the difference between absorption and marginal costing. You be aware that absorption costing is where you include your direct costs, but also an element of your indirect. Your marginal costing is where you only include your direct costs. The second question that they could ask, now it didn't ask in this paper, but I'm going to revise it, is the suitability of labour and machine hours. In this question they used machine hours, but they also could use labour hours. So you need to be able to explain when should a business use labour hours and when should it use machine hours. Okay, And the key word here that I want you all to be using is the main or the predominant stroke main activity. So you use labour hours when labour is the predominant or main activity in making the product, i.e. the product is labour intensive, it takes a lot of labour to produce the product, and so most costs in the business are surrounding and associated with the employment of labour. If labour is not the predominant activity, you should use machine hours. When would you use machine hours? You use machine hours when machine hours is the predominant or main activity, whereby most costs in the business are associated with the use of machines, i.e. making the product is machine intensive rather than making it by hand. And if machine hours is not the predominant activity, you use labour hours. That is a revision of that question on Pull It.